How's it going, everyone? It's your boy VC3. Welcome to another episode of the VC3 podcast. And today we're going to be discussing the economy. Ooh, it's a big topic. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to front. I might not be the most qualified. This is a little out of my wheelhouse. I'm more of like a history, military, big picture politics guy. But your boy did his homework. I took my time. That's why this video took so long. Took my time, put my study glasses on, got a little smart, learned a lot of new things. And I had an expert take a look at my documents, make sure that the sound, like the reasoning, the logic, everything was sound. I feel comfortable explaining these things to you guys. And I'm so excited to talk about this and to help you make a more informed decision. And so that when you go into the election booth on this November 3rd, oh my gosh, 5th? 3rd, 5th, geez, I don't even know the date. But when you head to the election polls, you feel more informed on your decision when it comes to the economy. So let's get right into it. So we're going to be discussing in the first half of this video who performed better while in office. We're going to be comparing, contrasting the administrations for their time while in office on GDP, or gross domestic product, overall inflation and the price of food, the average price of gas, and national debt. Who had a healthier and stronger economy, or GDP? So if we take a look at this graph on the right-hand side of the screen, we have in 2016, Obama had left the GDP sitting at 18.8 trillion and then passed that off to the Trump administration. The Trump administration then steadily rose GDP, peaking at 21.52 trillion in 2019. But then if you take a look at that last bar in red, you can see that it shrunk just a little bit. And so that GDP shrunk by approximately close to 1%, and then Trump administration then passed that off to the Biden-Harris administration. The Biden-Harris administration then, over the next 4 years, steadily increased GDP and peaked at $29.01 trillion. So during that whole time, during Trump's administration, GDP rose by approximately 4.5%. During the Biden-Harris administration, GDP rose roughly around 7%, 8% for all of those years, but tapered off there at the end at 6.1%. So overall, the Trump administration added 2.52 trillion to the US GDP, whereas the Biden-Harris administration added 7.33 trillion to the US GDP. So obviously, if we look at these factors on their own, and we don't take external factors into account, then obviously the Biden-Harris administration, when it comes to GDP, had a stronger, healthier overall economy that continued to grow. And with this new chart on screen, you'll see here, but we know that there was a major external factor at play. If we look at the chart I have here on screen, the gross domestic product, and we look at the overlays, we have Trump's administration, and we see that key recession where the GDP dropped significantly into that deep hole and then tried to climb back out, we can see that was right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So if we try to take a look at these administrations and compare them on these things, and without the external factor, which is COVID, if we don't take COVID into account, then sure, one person could be far better at this one thing, or another person could be far better at this other thing. But it doesn't make sense unless you take those external factors at play. We can't just put the GDP blame for contracting on Trump for what happened to him in 2020, because there was a major thing occurring. So we're going to try to unpack COVID and its ramifications on all these different sectors and get a little more to the truth and have some nuance on who actually performed better. And is that even the right question on some of these factors? COVID had a huge impact on GDP and the economy as a whole. So when COVID hit, what was happening? Well, modern economies are deeply integrated. They're all connected. So when COVID struck one economy, when it first occurred, it struck all the economies. And so we felt these vibrations from across the globe. The important economic sectors across the globe that were shutting down and important economic sectors here started operating at minimum capacity. So the economic output of the globe decreased and the economic output of the US decreased. And additionally, non-essential businesses, you guys remember this, were forced to shut down. My favorite brewery down the street had to shut down because it's non-essential. It's pretty essential to me, right? But so you have GDP shrinking from the most important sectors down to the non-essential sectors. And then finally, the interconnectivity of the globe. Critical supply chains across the globe came to a screeching halt. Shipping lanes were closed. We were not receiving goods from Asia or Europe anymore. They were not receiving goods from us. So that caused a significant crash, and the economy crashed fast. And that's the chart I have on screen on the right-hand side. The recession caused by COVID was deeper and faster than the Great Recession, which happened in 2008. And if you look at the chart, you can see the Great Recession outlined in gray, how shallow it is, but it's long, it's lengthy. And so when this happened, the federal government needed to respond quickly. There was two options. Either one, do nothing and just ride it out and see what happens, which is essentially what the government did in the 2008 Great Recession. They did very minimal spending. Or two, start spending money now to try to get us out of this recession. And thankfully, number two is what they went with. So when COVID hit, and now this next graph I have on screen is unemployment. It's not GDP, but the graphs look the same. So when COVID hit, the federal government enacted historical levels of spending to stimulate the economy. So the two major stimulus packages designed to combat COVID and to combat what was going on and get the economy going was the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan. I want you to think of this as like a paramedic or whoever does this in the medical field. When you have the patient dying, the doctor's there, they're like, get those electrical pads out and just start revving them up and give them a shock. Well, the first shock to our economy came from the CARES Act, and this was passed by Congress under the Trump administration and then signed off by Trump. And so some of the key portions of this act is when they started giving out those direct payments, the COVID stimulus checks. You guys remember that? Remember when it hit the bank? I was like, let's go, 1,200, come on. They placed a memorandum or moratorium on mortgages to stop people from getting kicked out of their houses. They extended assistance for unemployment. Unemployment got $600 extra a week. It's a lot of money, right? I had some friends doing that. You guys know who you are. And then they injected billions into the airlines. So this kept the economy going. And if you look at that chart, when the CARES Act was implemented in March, you can see unemployment then rapidly started climbing, started getting better and improving. And then as we reached the end of the Trump administration, you can see that it kind of like shallows out and starts to slow down, kind of comes back down a little bit. The trajectory completely changes. And so at that time, as Trump is starting to leave and his economic plan, the CARES Act, is starting to slow down, the Biden administration then comes in and they see that this economic turn down is happening. And then Congress and Biden agree, took a little bit of hassling, but Congress and Biden agree that, hey, we need to pass some more legislation. We need to get some more stimulus going. We need another shock or we might die. So they passed the American Rescue Plan, which provide more financial payments directly to people, another $1,400 to the bank. Let's go. Extended pandemic unemployment assistance so that unemployment kept going, and a couple other programs designed to help restaurants, designed to help small businesses. So we were spending tons of money. $2.3 trillion in the CARES Act, $1.9 trillion in the American Rescue Plan. And these rescue plans in the CARES Act saved America from a long-term recession, such as the 2008 Great Recession, which would have undoubtedly caused great pain and hardship for the average American. Yes, what we went through was hard. What we went through sucked. But it would have been even worse without these economic stimulus packages that stimulated the economy. But they were not consequence-free, as you will see later on in the video. So the question we need to be asking is not who did better, essentially. underneath these conditions, because obviously when COVID hits, it's going to throw everything out the window. It's not who had a higher GDP during their administration did better. Like we talked about, Biden-Harris administration, the GDP is better. What the real question we need to ask is, did each administration perform at a higher or lower level than what was projected? So did they improve the recovery, or did they hold back the recovery? And so how can we figure this out? Well, in January of 20th, the CBO, which is the Congressional Budgetary Office, they released their projections for the pandemic. And so the CBO, they are a nonpartisan institution that provides analysis to U.S. Congress on economic and budgetary matters. They're very important. A lot of the reports they come out with every year, I digress, but they came out with the projection. And if you look on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see that projection here. So the gray on the chart is the actual GDP that the U.S. had during that time, okay? The orange is the January 20th projection. Excuse me, this is, I got it confused, but the January 20th projection is the pre-pandemic projection. So this was where our economy was supposed to be heading towards in growth and GDP before COVID impacted us, okay? And then the July 20th projection, this is the one I was talking about, which was given out by the CBO, they're both by the CBO, but this is what the CBO was stating that was going to happen to our economy after COVID. That was where we were, what was supposed to occur, what was supposed to happen. And as you can see by the graph on screen, the Trump administration and Congress at the time kept the economy from crashing as deep as projected, and it rebounded quickly. Man, like, just look at that. Look how fast it came back up, and thankfully things didn't get as worse as they were projected to be. And this GDP still shows you that little slowdown that Trump had towards the end of his administration. And when the Biden administration came in and they saw that and they recognized this, and them in Congress passed more legislation, started stimulating the economy more, you can see that our actual GDP got back on track, kept going, kept rising, breached our projected GDP of January 20th of this time. Then there were some struggles that occurred between mid-January 21 and mid-2021 and mid-2022. There were some economic struggles, some economic hardships that slowed down, some challenges that slowed down the government, right? We all felt those. And then finally, in 2023, the actual GDP of the U.S. reached and surpassed the projection of the pre-COVID projection. This is remarkable. Let me slow down and back up real quick. What the Trump administration did, keeping us from nosediving as deep as projected, rebounding us quicker than projected, and even though there was a little slow at the end, that they did what the Trump administration and Congress did their duty. In the situation they were in, they added and kept us out of the dumps and kept us moving the right way and helped our country recover. That was fantastic. The Biden administration, when we look at that line to the right, did the same thing. Kept our economy moving in the right direction. And when our economy had some challenges, eventually got us back on track to surpass the pre-pandemic projections. And this is remarkable. Well, why, Vince? Why is this remarkable? Here on this next slide, you can see on the right-hand side, if we look at the nations around the globe, so if we look at Canada, the European area, we look up the United Kingdom, these are nations that have not recovered and surpassed their pre-pandemic projections. So Canada, Europe, UK, they're all 4% or more lower than their pre-pandemic levels. We have surpassed our pre-pandemic level. This is fantastic. And if we look at our history, right, if we look at the last time we had a major recession, 2008, we never got back on track from our pre-2008 projection. If you look at it down there at the bottom, we were 9% lower than where we're supposed to be during that projection, and we still to this day have not surpassed where that projection would be today. So this is historic, and this is remarkable. And this is something that I could not find any other wealthy nation at the time of this writing has achieved. So it's very important that we keep these things in mind. So when these candidates claim that one candidate is destroying our economy and destroying our nation, right, or the economy aspect, or that the other left us with the worst economy in U.S. history, these statements are simply not true. The candidates are trying to oversimplify the issue to get your vote, instead of explaining the truth and allowing you to form an honest and objective opinion. And like I talked about, the vast quantities of money that were being injected into the economy through the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan were not consequence free. And especially with global effects of COVID and supply chains, all this ties in and has made additional impacts on our economy. Next topic, who had lower overall inflation? Well, let's go to the facts and the figures and stop listening to what the candidates are saying on the campaign trail. So the facts and the figures. In 2016, the Obama administration left a very low overall inflation rate of 1.3%, and that off to the Trump administration. The Trump administration over the first 2 years in office, from 2017 to 2018, inflation slowly rose and peaked at 2.5%. Over the next 2 years, the Trump administration was able to reduce inflation rates down to 1.7%, which was slightly higher than what the Obama administration had left the Trump administration. On the flip side, when we look at food, right? So this is just looking at the actual inflation on food. The Obama administration left a very low inflation rate level of 0.28%, then hand that over to the Trump administration. And over the 4 years, ups and downs of the Trump administration, the food rate at the end of the Trump administration peaked at 3.43%, far higher than what Obama had left. The Biden-Harris administration came into office, and over the first 2 years, overall inflation levels drastically increased to 8.0.2% at its highest. This is a massive increase, almost 700% increase. This is huge. Then over the next 2 years, the Biden-Harris administration was able to decrease inflation significantly, down from 8.02 to 3.2%. Now look, 3.2% is still nearly double from what the Trump administration had left the Biden-Harris administration, right? It's significantly more. But if we look at the peak levels of the Trump administration, 2.5%, 3.2 is not that far off. So what this is signaling is that inflation is starting to get closer to the pre-pandemic levels. It's not there, but it's getting closer. And if we look at food on the flip side, actually, food peaked at 9.92% inflation rate in 2022. God, we all know how hard 2022 was. That sucked, right? But today, in 2024, the inflation on our food prices is now down to 2.24%, which is lower than what the Trump administration had left the Biden-Harris administration in 2020. And it's lower also than the 2018 levels. So again, you're starting to see the change of these rates starting to get closer to that pre-COVID era. If we compare both of these administrations in a vacuum without considering COVID, then obviously the Trump administration did far better on overall inflation. The majority of the years, their inflation was lower than the majority of the years in the Biden-Harris administration. But we know that COVID was a major external factor. So the real questions we need to be asking are, why was inflation so high under the Biden-Harris administration? And are the Biden-Harris administration's economic policies to blame for such high inflation? Stay with me and we'll get down to the bottom of those questions. So what caused inflation to be so high? Well, COVID had some key impacts on inflation. The first thing, like we talked about earlier, important economic sectors across the globe and here at the US operated at minimum capacity. Okay, their furnaces, their production chains, all of the things that go into producing whatever it was that they were making is now operating at a minimum capacity. And non-essential businesses like my bar down the street shut down. So because of this, all of the supply, so supply and demand theory here, all of the supplies were now drastically decreased, which dries up overall inflation because you have less goods, less supply on the market. Additionally, critical supply chains across the globe came to a screeching halt, which also decreased supply of goods and drove up overall inflation. We're no longer getting goods from Asia and Europe. Those items we wanted are no longer there. Whatever is here, and whatever we can get is here. So those prices are going to go up, and inflation is going to be driven up because of that. Once the global economy reopened and demands for goods skyrocketed. So when the global economy reopened and the supply chains were now bringing goods over, right? And we have stuff trickling in, and people are now free to do what they want to do, right? The demand to purchase items significantly rose because we were locked down for a year. We couldn't do anything for a year, but now we're free. We want to buy things. We want to travel. We'll get to the travel part. But we want to spend our money. We have a lot more money in our pocket because of the CARES Act and because of the American Rescue Plan. So we want to go spend that money. That drives up the overall levels of inflations. And because supply chains were struggling to catch up to this demand to get back at full operating capacity, if you think about if you look at the image on screen, you think about those times when you heard the stories of the ports in LA and the ports in the East Coast were all full and all these empty shipping containers were sitting there and all these ships were outside in the ocean just waiting off the coast to deliver my Amazon package, and I was angry and frustrated because it said I'd get it. I have Prime, it said I'd get it in 24 hours, but instead I got it in a week, so I'm pissed, right? Like all of that drove up the demand for goods and overall inflation. And the freight rates, because were way more expensive because of all the congestion they were going through, that also drove up the overall inflation. And also, the final factor here with this is that there was a worker shortage at the time, and that exacerbated the problem. So COVID itself created these issues. And as you can guess, these issues are outside of the control of the presidency. There isn't a single person on this planet who can snap their fingers and fix and solve all of those problems. And just to drive home the point, I have two quotes up here from two very reputable sources talking about this. So from Brookings Institution, most of the rise of inflation in 2021 and 2022 was driven by developments that directly raised prices rather than wages, including sharp increases in global commodity prices and sectoral price spikes driven by a combination of pandemic-included kinks in supply chains and a huge shift in demand during the pandemic from goods to services. So that's one of the primary drivers on inflation, and the president has zero control essentially over that. What else drove inflation? Because that can't just be the only answer. There's probably other factors, right? Just like with anything, there's always multiple factors. Well, as we talked about it, we all had more money in our pockets. We were willing and ready to spend. Those COVID checks were sitting in my pocket hot. I needed to get that money off me. The Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco conducted a study from 2020 to the end of 2021. And what they did is they looked at core inflation rate in the US and compared it to the core inflation rate of the OECD median. OECD stands for the Organization of Economic Co-Cooperation and Development, OECD. These are high income nations just like us, and they have a high human index score just like us. And so these are comparable nations. Our core inflation was very similar to their core inflation up into the point to where we started injecting and infusing large amounts of money into our economy. So once we started passing the CARES Act and the American Recovery Act and giving direct money into our pockets, this study found that increased inflation by up to 3%, which is massive, right? But at the same time, though, that spending is what got us out of the hole and what kept us from suffering economic hardship. Yes, what we went through is hard, but it would have been worse. It would have been longer. So that is another factor that drove inflation by 3 percentage points. Here's the quote right here. The sizable fiscal support measures aimed at counteracting the economic collapse due to the COVID-19 pandemic could explain about 3 percentage points of the recent rise of inflation. About 3%. So we have 3% from this, maybe 2% from the other COVID things that we just talked about, the supply chains and all that. That gets you about 5%. In we would we say 2021 or 2022, the peak was 8%, so 5% from 8%. So maybe inflation's actually really 3%. So you see how these are starting to add up, and now we can see why inflation was so high. It's starting to make sense here. So in conclusion here, the president does not have the power to pass legislation on their own. They can advocate for legislation, they can sign off on bills, or they can veto the legislation. But both administrations signed off on these large spending bills, the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan, which ultimately staved off a long-term recession at the cost of increasing inflation. Additionally, supply chain issues and massive consumer demand, which is outside the control of the president, helped drive inflation. Therefore, both administrations are at fault for the higher levels of the inflation the U.S. experienced from 2020 to the end of 2021. So no one's really at fault here. They did their jobs, and this is just a consequence of our increased spending. Furthermore, just to labor the point a little bit more and to talk about inflation past 2021, because that covered inflation up to 2021. So past 2021, global, so if we compare U.S. inflation to OECD, which we talked about, those high income economies, and we compare inflation to the rest of the globe, U.S. inflation was actually lower than the rest of the globe and lower than OECD, and has recovered remarkably faster. So just take a look at the graph on the right hand side. The black line represents the U.S., and you can see the end of 2021 and 2022 we had our spike. But if you look at 2022 in the light blue, the same year, you'll see that OECD, their spike was higher than us. We were sitting at 8% and they were sitting at a higher rate. I can't really see it from here. I'm kind of blind, but their peak was higher than our peak. And since 2022, we have been recovering faster, way faster than they have by 2 percentage points. And then if you look at the globe, so those were the high income countries, very similar countries to ours. If you look at the globe, our peak was lower than the global rate. And if you look at 2023 and 2024, we've recovered significantly faster than the rest of the globe. Inflation was not just a U.S. problem, but a global problem because of the impacts of COVID on the economy and supply and demand. While inflation was high for our standards, it was lower than what the globe was experiencing and has been recovering much faster, like we said. Yes, high inflation absolutely sucked because our food, our goods, and our gas prices past 2021, and we're going to get to gas prices, cost us a shit ton of extra money. And sometimes we had to make tough financial decisions on what we're going to buy at the store, how much money we're going to put into our tank of gas. But compared to the rest of the globe, we had it good. And over the last 2 years, we've been recovering at a remarkable pace. I think it's important that we validate the challenges that we go through here in the United States. At the same time, we also need to put those challenges into perspective with the rest of the globe. So therefore, when these candidates are campaigning and they attempt to cast blame on each other for high inflation rates or claim that they're better on the economy because inflation was lower during their administration, they're leaving out critical information and oversimplifying the issue to get your vote, instead of explaining the truth and allowing you to form an honest and objective opinion like an adult, like how an American voter should be treated. All right, gas prices, another one that hit our wallet, kept me home. If we look at our chart on the right-hand side, the Trump administration inherited a low gas rate of $2 average and rate of gas of $2.25 from the Obama administration. Over the next 2 years, the Trump administration's average price of gas rose slightly to $2.81. Then over the next 2 years, that gas rate dropped significantly back down essentially to what Obama had passed over to the Trump administration at $2.26. That's a low rate, $2.26, man. And the Biden administration saw a significant jump in gas prices all the way up to $4.06, which is nearly double the Trump administration's average gas price. Then over the next 2 years of the Biden-Harris administration, gas prices dropped down to $3.38. So again, this is more than $1 than what the Trump administration had left the Biden-Harris administration, which is a lot, right? It doesn't feel good when I'm swiping at the pump. But when you compare it to 2018, which was the peak of the Trump administration's average price of gas of $2.81, it's roughly 50 cents away. So we're starting to see the gas prices start to get closer to pre-pandemic levels. They're not there yet. I'm not saying that they're there, but they're starting to get there. And if we look at this problem, this issue set without taking COVID into account and all the other things I'm about to talk about, then obviously the Trump administration did far better than the Biden-Harris administration. But the questions we need to be asking is, why was gas so cheap during the final year of the Trump administration? And why was gas so high during the Biden-Harris administration? And did they do anything to try to lower those prices? What we need to talk about first is what actually drives the price of gas. Why is gas so expensive? What makes up gas? So there's 4 components that make up the retail price of gas, with the largest component being the cost of crude oil. The other 3 components, you have refinery, you have distribution and marketing, and you have federal and state taxes. But crude oil is the majority of the cost of the retail price of gas. So it's largely determined by supply and demand. Good old supply and demand theory, right? Economics. Low amount of supply, so if you start taking supply off the market, will drive up the cost. If you don't have that many of them, you can charge a lot more for it. Take a low amount of supply, drives up the cost. High demand will also drive up the cost. If a lot of people want to travel, a lot of people want to start getting on planes and getting in their vehicles, that's going to drive up the cost. Hint, hint for you guys for what we're talking about here. But so that's the main thing that drives the price of crude oils. OPEC Plus, which is called the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC Plus, and which you can see in that graphic I have in the middle of the screen, is this collection, this 23 member states that are all highly dependent on oil for their economic revenues. They have come together and joined and made this pact called OPEC Plus, and their goal is to regulate global oil prices. They do this by coordinating on reducing the amount of crude oil that is on the market or increasing production. And like we talked about, reducing the amount of crude oil that's on the market is going to increase the cost. Reducing supply increases the cost. And if they were to increase supply, that's going to decrease the cost. So which one do you think they do more often? It's a test question at the end of the video. One of the main examples that demonstrated the power of OPEC and their ability to cut oil out of the market and drive prices up was actually the 1973 oil crisis, when during the 1973 Arab-Israeli war, they're called OPEC at the time, but I'm just going to call them OPEC. OPEC, what they did is they put an oil embargo on the U.S. for supporting Israel. And by doing so, these cuts nearly quadrupled the price of gas in the U.S. It's on screen. I can't really see it from where I'm standing or sitting, but essentially went from like $3, $3.69.12 to like $11.65. It's like 2 something to $11.65. Imagine $11.65. Like, it's insane. And so this caused massive amounts of economic harm to the U.S., obviously, because gas went through the roof. People had to pay 4 times the price for gas. That'd be insane. And then there was a shortage of gas because we weren't getting any more gas from the Middle East, these OPEC or OPEC nations anymore. And so we realized that was a security risk for our country. And so you had all of these cars lined up waiting outside. So that's the power of OPEC and their ability to influence gas prices. Let's just walk through a timeline, nice and easy, from when COVID hit till now, on some of the key developments that have either increased or decreased the price of gas. So when COVID hit, you can see in this chart that I have on screen, gas prices started to slow. Why did they slow? Well, like we talked about, international and national travel drastically slowed. People were on lockdown. You're not going anywhere. Stay inside and do push-ups, read a book, watch a movie. So that's what people were doing. They stopped traveling. So no gas is being consumed in planes, in cars, in whatever you drive. Residential, commercial, and industrial consumption of gas also decreased. The furnaces, the gas that you're used to power whatever, that's no longer being used anymore by businesses. So all of that started to decrease the price of gas. And then as we go further along the timeline, you see OPEC did not like this because their economies are highly dependent on oil, on the price of crude oil. So what they did is they decided to cut out 10%. I think it's like 10 million barrels, I think, something like that per day. Close, maybe it's 9.7 million barrels. I don't know the number, it's in the notes somewhere. But essentially they cut out 10% of oil from the supply to try to increase the price of gas. And as you can see from that graph, that's exactly what happened. And so during that time, as gas prices were significantly low, oil refineries here on the West Coast, and I think there's some in the East Coast as well. I have to take a look exactly, I forgot. But oil refineries actually had to shut down because they were no longer making profit. So the U.S. lost 4.5% of its oil refinery production. If you think back to that graph I showed you, price of gas, oil refineries was in there. And so by losing those oil refineries, our price of gas is now, once we start making gas, right, and we use the crude oil, we start turning it into actual gas, that price is going to jump up a little bit because we don't have the capacity to refine, which is going to increase the cost. Okay, so just hold that in there. So when 2021 comes around and businesses and start opening up, travel starts occurring again, planes are flying and cars are going and humming, prices start rising. Demand is now increasing the price of gas, and those oil refineries, like talked about, they can't keep up, so they're struggling, and so now prices go up even more. So as we keep going forward and those prices are jumping and everybody's loving life because they can do all the things that they couldn't do for the last year and a half, now we have the unjustified Russian invasion of Ukraine. So when Russia invades Ukraine, the entire Western world, the majority of the world decides, hey, we should probably stop buying gas from these guys who are using that money to then fuel an invasion, a whole war on a democratic nation. It's probably not a good idea to give these guys money off of that gas. So we stop taking their gas, which cuts supply. Like we talked about, when you cut supply, prices go up. And so in blue on that chart, what the Biden-Harris administration did, which they attempted to do to reduce the price of gas and to stop it from climbing so high as it did, is they started releasing oil from our strategic reserves. So they started to increase the supply of gas on the market to make our prices cheaper. This is a good thing to do to keep the price of gas low in critical situations. There is a negative side. The strategic reserve is there in case of emergencies, if there's natural disasters, if we had to go to war, if big, refineries blew up and we had to rely on the gas, that all we had. So there's a risk-reward ratio calculus that was made, and the Biden administration decided that it was worth it to release gas to try to make it cheaper for us at the pump. And so you can see that as it starts to decrease. And then again, OPEC, they decide, hey, you know what? The U.S. is flooding the market with gas and trying to keep gas low. We are going to start cutting more. So they cut in 2023. They cut in April. They cut again. So all of this complicated, kind of messy picture of all these different things, this is how the price of gas is actually determined. Let's sum it all up. The president does not have the ability to significantly impact the average price of gas. They really don't. There's not a lot of options. External factors such as OPEC Plus driving up the price of crude oil plays the largest part, while the quality and quantity of oil refineries in the U.S. is something that we can do, that our legislation can do, that Congress can do, and that the president can advocate for, absolutely. And each state's tax and gas plays a smaller but important part in determining the average price of gas. So the taxes, I didn't talk about this yet, but the federal and the state taxes, which play a smaller part, that's up to each state on how much they want to tax. That's up to Congress how much they want to tax. It's not necessarily the president who can sign something or can just give orders and change these things. They can advocate, absolutely, but again, they don't have significant power over these. And so, but like I said, POTUS can advocate for increasing more crude oil production in the U.S., which we are the number one producers. Yes, we are number one in everything. Advocate for investing in oil refineries and releasing crude oil, something the president can do just off the bat from the strategic reserves. But of course, like we talked about, there's risk and reward with that. Therefore, When either of these political candidates attempt to use the price of gas as a talking point to either bolster their candidacy by claiming they're the reason, the sole reason for cheap gas, or to place blame for expensive gas prices squarely on the other candidate, none of these arguments really hold water. They just don't when you look at the facts and the role of the president and the presidential powers. Let's move on to national debt. So this might actually be the most important topic that we actually discuss, and I didn't know that until I started researching for this video. And just stay with me here. This is vital, and this is something I want you to think about all the time. Every election, every president, and what they want to do, what they want to achieve, national debt should come up in your mind, probably number one. All right, so the national debt enables the federal government to pay for important programs and services for the American public. But the massive levels of national debt pose a serious economic risk to the United States if the U.S. does not decrease the debt soon. So who does the government owe money to? Well, 80% of it is public debt. So this is debt that's actual real debt that the government owes. And that's real because the government actually has to pay this back. It's not just debt that we owe to ourselves. Roughly 30% of this debt is held by foreign countries like Japan, China, and the UK. So why is having massive levels of debt an issue? I mean, just think about this. If you owe massive debt on your credit card, what does that do? You have less finances to spend on the things you want to spend them on. You have less finances to spend on emergencies. You have a significant portion of your income being sent to other people that you owe to other people. So all of these issues that we deal with as people, this is what the government is dealing with, but on a larger, grander scale, and it involves all of us. Then the risks are far worse than the risk that we can think of as just individuals. So for number one, it puts pressure on interest rates and reduces economic growth. Terrible things. We don't need those. We want to be growing. We don't want to be shrinking. The more federal debt that is held abroad, the larger share of our national income and growth that occurs to those living in other countries rather than American households. So our money is flowing out of the country into the coffers and being circulated into the economies of other countries. We need our money here. We don't need our money over there. 3, the U.S. risks a significant financial crisis. So investors, as our debt continues to climb like it's been climbing over the last 100 years, investors are likely to demand higher interest rates, and confidence in the U.S. government fiscal position is going to erode. And these things can lead to an inflation spiral. Like, we just got done talking about how terrible inflation was, how much it sucked, and how much we hate inflation. This can lead to an inflation spiral. Like, this is horrible. It could lead to a massive devaluation of the dollar. So when you travel to Thailand, or you travel out of the country somewhere in Southern America, and you exchange your $1 and you get $100 of whatever that country's money is worth, now you're going to get $1, or you're going to get half a dollar, because our dollar is now devalued. Interest rates are going to spike. These are just issues that can destroy our society. We've seen how even moderate levels of inflation that we just went through, how it impacted us. Do we really want to go through all of these other issues? No, we don't. So over the coming decade, economic spending on interest payments is the fastest growing part of the federal budget, actually. So we spend more money, the federal government spends more money on interest payments than to children, than on children in the U.S. I'm going to say that again. The federal government spends more money on our interest payments than we do on children in the U.S. And here's the kicker. Here's the big one. Spending on interest payments will exceed spending on national defense by 2027. One more time. Spending on interest payments will exceed spending on national defense by 2027. We have the largest military in the world. We spend more money than the next 10 nations combined. And I mean, that's not really true. China, PPP, it's significant. It's when they underreport what they actually spend on, but whatever, that's a tangent. But our interest payments, we're going to be spending more money on that than our national defense. That's insane. Insane. And finally, it leads to less money in the U.S. coffers to respond to emergencies such as COVID or the 2 hurricanes that just ravaged Florida, which resulted in at least 24 deaths and untold amount of property damage and untold amount of people whose life savings were wiped away. So this is an issue we need to get a hold of now, because if we don't, and we keep kicking it down the can and raising the national debt, you know who's going to deal with this? Our children, our grandchildren. And how are you going to feel if that's what you leave for your children and for your grandchildren to deal with? Now we understand the national debt. Who actually increased the national debt? So this one's actually easy, and now you can talk about the chart. So both administrations added 7.7 trillion to the national debt. It's a massive amount of number. It's huge. It's huge. COVID spending was a significant portion for both administrations. Trump administration spent 2.5 on COVID. The Biden-Harris administration spent 2.8 on COVID. So essentially, the Trump administration spent slightly more on non-COVID related things. So they spent 5.2 trillion versus the Biden-Harris, which spent 4.9 trillion. It's a wash, essentially. But when it comes to the national debt, both candidates spent an enormous amount of money that was not COVID related, further driving the U.S. towards economic ruin. And like I said, our children and grandchildren will have to face devastating consequences if we do not reverse this trend now.